practical areas of the payload launcher's interface, the technique that continues to this day. The first test of a new rocket design was never expected to go well, but the Saturn one performed flawlessly. It was a small step towards President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon. Although Congress was allocating huge sums for what was now called Project Apollo, NASA still had no clear idea how they could do it. There were two competing approaches: direct ascent, where astronauts would ride a huge craft directly to the moon, landed there, and then turn on Earth. Rendezvous, where two rockets would launch separate parts into Earth orbit, which would link up and then fly to the moon and land. There were various concepts for a spacecraft that could fly from the Earth to the moon, land, and then return. All were huge. Both of these approaches would require a rocket of huge proportions and design. For the giant Nova were studied, there was a third method proposed, which required a rendezvous in lunar orbit. It called for a dedicated lunar lander, which could discarded after it served its purpose. Lander engineer John Bott was convinced that this was the only way to get to the moon within President Kennedy's 1969 deadline. So, in July 1961, Gus Grissom had become America's second astronaut with another 15-minute suborbital flight. At this stage, to craft rendezvous in orbit was seen as a tremendous challenge. Her rendezvous in lunar orbit was seen as madness, and who bolts a lunar orbit rendezvous was dismissed, but who bold an informal group working at the Langley had been studying the problems associated with orbital rendezvous since the 1950s, and they understood the mathematics well. Very frustrated at having the lunar orbit rendezvous plan blocked from access to higher management. So he wrote a strongly worded letter to NASA administrator. In it, he asserted that the only way to meet the presidential deadline was for. He insisted that a man could be put on the moon without the need for NOVA, with the LOR concept now in open. The theory and the calculations were scrutinized closely, and while the idea was still resisted until the plan was sound, finally, when Furno von Braun became convinced, lunar orbit rendezvous was adopted. In August 1961, Germany Tidal was operating to become Russia's second cosmonaut. At cosmonaut 825, he remains the youngest person to fly in space. His flight in Vostok 2 made 17 orbits with Tito remaining aloft for more than a day. He was the first man to eat in space, the first man to sleep in space, and the first man to suffer from space sickness. NASA were resigned to their second ranking in what had become known as the space race. With the newest version of the Atlas booster, they felt they were closing the gap, and unmanned flight went well, but they were still worried too. The humiliation of this astronauts corps. Chimp 81, later called Enos, would be the first to fly on. The Atlas, it was the first capsule to have solid-state electronics. So there were some small problems during this flight, but Enos returned safely, paving the way for NASA's first manned orbital flight. In February 1962, John Glenn was to be the first American to go into the orbit. In capsule hit named Friendship 7, the American people were taking their country's role in the space race very seriously. Now, Glenn's flight was an opportunity for the U.S. to salvage some pride. John Glenn completed 3 orbits and returned to an Atlantic splashdown without incident as development continued successfully on the Stretcher booster and the Mercury program began more ambitious missions. NASA was getting a clearer view of its path to the moon. A new group of astronauts was recruited with names like Neil Armstrong, Johnny Young, and James Lovell, and lunar orbit rendezvous plan meant that a new program would be implemented before Apollo. So from here, we're gonna continue and tell you more details. So what happened next after this? So this is very important to watch related to this journey. So originally called Mercury to the program eventually emerged as a Project Gemini, a larger version of the Mercury capsule that would carry two astronauts was rapidly designed. It featured ejector seats like a jet fighter, and it would be boosted to orbit atop a refinement of the Titan II missile originally intended to carry a nuclear warhead. Training for the two-man missions began ahead of a tightly packed schedule of launches. Additional Mercury missions were scrapped. There were very specific objectives laid down for the Gemini program. Orbital rendezvous had to be mastered, and docking with the target vehicle had to become routine planner. Also known that any trip to the moon would involve leaving the spacecraft and surviving in the vacuum of space in a pressure suit. New infrastructure was built at Cape Canaveral, a giant vehicle assembly building for the coming Saturn family of rockets was commenced. In Alabama, a captive rocket test facility was built, and there were new engine test stands constructed in Mississippi. At the new Manned Space Center in Houston, Texas, a new mission control hub was constructed. It would monitor every detail of every mission, largely due to the energy of Vice President Lyndon Johnson's. Texas was to become the focal point of America's space effort. It was September 1962 before a crowd in the stadium of Rice University in Houston. That gave such a warm welcome to our President of the United States. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. This was the saying of the President. Decade and do the in this decade and do the other things not because they are easily, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. Though the American people were largely on side with the country's space goal, Kennedy understood that the huge expenditures now being made could easily lead to an erosion of the national support. But in little more than 12 months, when President returned to Texas, he was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson was now the president. He strengthened his position in 1964 with a landslide win in the presidential election, and under his leadership, America's space objectives remained unchanged. In August 1962, the Soviet Union had set another space post. Vostok 3 and Vostok 4 orbited at the same time. So NASA felt the Russians were already working towards orbital rendezvous. So in June 1963, another cosmonaut was preparing for another first voyage. Valentina Tereshkova will be the first woman to go into orbit in October 1964. Vladimir Komarov, the commander, flight engineer, Konstantin Feoktistov, and medical specialist Boris Yegorov flew to orbit on a new spacecraft was God 1, and they wore